Today I figured we'd go over all the epoxy experiments I've been having with these oddly shaped timbers I've got here and explain how we've managed to overcome all the difficulties and prevent all the leaks. Let's get started then. So to start things off, which epoxy brand do I use? At the moment we're using the Swindon Composites one I've got here. I believe this is the EH25/125. It's a deep pore resin. We have tried the Glass Cast 50, which is pretty comparable to this one. It's just the Swindon one's cheaper, so with how expensive epoxy is, we'll stick with this one. The thing with the deep pore ones, they take a lot longer to harden up, which in some cases is handy. These ones are 24 hours. So we had tried using an epoxy resin that took 5 days to cure. However, because of how long it took, it tended to make a lot of mess through leaks everywhere. And the 5-day waiting period to be able to do anything with it made it awkward to use. The cat pee smell also didn't help. We also contemplated getting the very thin coat epoxy resins for painting on top of things. However, that didn't really suit my needs, because we'd rather just have one type of epoxy that we can use for everything, which this stuff has been a good all-rounder. We did try using some clear polyester resin, as this stuff cures within around 10 minutes, so it doesn't really have time to leak out as long as it's done properly. The issue with it, however, was it has an incredibly strong smell from all the VOCs, so you definitely need some sort of charcoal ventilation or extractors or a fume mask with charcoal filters in. Otherwise you're going to be getting some glowing red eyes, or hail the Mothman. One of the main issues we had with the polyester resin was the shrinkage issues. So I've got one here, a cookie. So it would, when doing the mixture and pouring, as it cured, it tended to leave a big ridge down the center here. And if it didn't do a ridge down the center of the resin, it would pull away from the sides of the actual wood itself. Usually only one side, as it didn't bond to it very well. So we tried to get around this issue by getting this here. This is a flexible additive that you can get to go with the polyester. This seemed to help initially at first, as it made the polyester actually move with the wood movement, because all wood moves. However, after a while of use or in storage, it still ended up pulling away from the sides here. So it just wasn't really worth all the hassle. The other downsides are, as the polyester contains a lot of solvents, it ended up melting a lot of the tapes we used to try and keep all the resin in while we were doing the treatment. And when it comes to sanding, it makes an absolute sticky mess of the belts. As soon as it starts to heat up, and when you're sanding it, it seems to go gooey and just clogs up the belts like crazy, so it's not really worth doing that. An issue we had with the epoxy resin, especially when it came to the cold seasons, was the resin itself going cloudy and forming crystals. They do not like being below temperatures around 15 degrees when in storage, so we did everything we could to ensure it didn't get to that by making this handy insulated storage box here. So it's made out of polystyrene insulation sheets. It's 100mm thick, and it has a heater in. So initially, if I lift this up here, there's a heater here that we put on the top. It was low powered because we figured it only needs to be lightly heated to around 20 degrees. However, due to the issues of convection, also known as heat rising, we had issues actually heating up the resin itself. Even with a fan on the heater, it just couldn't move enough air to get the heat to heat up the resin at the bottom. So we've ignored that now, and instead of just using the remote temperature sensor that we've got on it to monitor that everything's okay, and instead we've swapped to a heat mat, which is at the bottom of the box. This ensures that the resin itself is actually being heated up directly, and we haven't had any issues with that. And we've got a thermostat on the front of the box, which we use to do all the controlling for it. We keep it at around 25 degrees constantly, and we've had zero issues with that, even when it's been in the negative temperatures. Whoop. So down we go. Very important note, if you can see the lid, do not store anything in this that can dissolve polystyrene. So, for example, like the polyester resins or acetone, they will literally melt this. Even if the actual liquid doesn't come in contact with it, the fumes will start to dissolve it. So be careful what you store in these things. So I've got here the heating film that I've been using in the box then to provide the heat. So this is the Thermofol brand one. It's underfloor heating, and this one is particularly rated for 220 watts of heat per square meter. So this particular sheet here is 110 watts of heat. So in my box, I've got two of these stacked on top of each other. And then we have a 3mm thick piece of hardboard on top of that to add a layer of protection. But also we've gone with a thin one, as we don't want it too thick that it stops all the heat from actually being able to rise, because it's insulating it. Something that you should also consider is putting a damp-proof membrane in on top of everything as an effective bag in the box, just in case you have a burst or stuff starts leaking, so then it's all contained and you don't end up encasing all your heating film. Mixing wise then, we went through a few different adventures on that. So when we started out, we had two of these style mixing buckets. We figured being reusable, it'd be a lot cheaper in the long run. So obviously it is. So you need two of them because you want to mix in one, and then once you've done that, pour it into another bucket and then carry on mixing from there. That's to ensure you get it done properly. However, the downside of these is cleaning them up afterwards. We started out using isopropyl alcohol, however that didn't help with cleaning the epoxy resin. So we swapped to acetone, which actually dissolved it, but we still ended up spending a long time trying to clean the epoxy out after each use. Which is where, so obviously you got your disposable cups, so we got the large one and a small one here. Maybe a bit more wasteful, but the ease of just throwing them out after you're done with them, it's a lot more efficient on time, but not waste, so that's down to personal preference. The reason we've got two is down to the amount obviously we need to use. There's no point in buying lots of these. Larger ones if we're doing mainly small batches, and from the small ones is obviously you can only make a small amount, so get the appropriate size cup for the job. And again, it's the same thing, mix in one, pour into another. We also have a silicone cup. So we don't mix in this one, but what this one is for is, once we've mixed the mixture, is to put it in there. And because it's flexible and has a nice handy spout, it means that we can, here we go, fill in the splits like that. I don't know how much that's going to be able to show up on the camera, but normally when we're doing these, we'd have tape going up both sides, and then we'd have to try and fill in that small gap there, which if you're using the disposable cups of the bucket, you're not going to really be able to get in there very accurately, whereas this thing, you can actually flex it to go in however you want. So, something to consider for them. Put that down there, and that back there. And the actual mixing basis, we've obviously got the different size wooden sticks. So we've got these thin ones, which we started out with, which they are fine if you're doing small mixtures. So if you're doing like the smaller cup there, and you've got a small amount, it's fine to do that. But the biggest issue with these is they obviously flex a lot, so as the mixture gets a bit thick, you can end up being just bending the stick instead of actually mixing anything. So obviously, that's where bigger sticks are a lot handier. So you can technically just stick to using the big sticks, but it's handy to have a bit of a choice in the matter. So they obviously do not have the bending issue, and are definitely handy if you're doing the larger cups. We also trialed, so this here, this is a reusable mixer. So it's got holes in it, which help to, well, mix up the mixture as you're doing it. The biggest issue again is afterwards is cleaning it, but also primarily it only really works if you're doing large amounts. So if you're doing something in like the bucket or the tall cup, I mean the tall cup it's still a bit whoop, where's that gone? There. Even the tall cup, it can be annoying to do that in. So it's just the wet side of things. Whoop. But the bucket, whoop, there it is. It can do that in there. So if you're going to get the reusable ones, only use it for the large quantities. And finally, when it actually comes to spreading, we've got this spreader card here. So if you get the cookie back, whoop. When it comes to spreading epoxy on a surface, we'd get one of these with dollop a load on and then spread it out via the tapered side there or on one of the grooved sides, depending on how thick it is. Just go across like that. Just try and make sure it's all evened out. Sadly, my employees don't really use that much anymore. For this, instead, they use the nitrile gloves that they're wearing. Just basically put it on and just spread it out evenly by hand, because fortunately with the cards you can't really do the sides of these very well with the cards, so you've got to do that by hand anyway. So that's a personal preference thing. If you're doing a big large table, the cards are probably more worthwhile. One thing you'll definitely need when doing all the epoxy mixing is an accurate pair of scales. So the brands I've gone with, they use a 2:1 ratio for the mixture. So you'd use, for example, 100 grams of the epoxy and then 50 grams of the hardener. If you then go over and, for example, do 105 grams of the epoxy, you then want to try and get as close to 52.5 grams of hardener as you can. So we'd go up to 53, for example. That's because unlike something like polyester resin, which uses a catalyst, which you can adjust the ratio mixture to based on the temperature and other factors, epoxy wants as close to it as you can so that it actually gets every part of it hardened correctly. If you get the mixture wrong, you might end up with a quite soft epoxy, or it might end up cracking. So ensure that you get that mixture right, get a good set of scales that's as accurate as possible. Once you've made the mixture, what we then do is set a timer for 2 minutes. Ideally, having something like a smart speaker will help with this, so you don't need to touch anything. And then get mixing away. So with these, you want to try and make sure you get every single part mixed up. So scrape the sides, scoop the bottom up a few times and just keep going around, reverse direction. This isn't the same as like a Ribena or a squash mixture. You want to make sure it's thoroughly mixed. So keep going for the 2 minutes, don't stop. And then after that, get another cup, and then slowly pour it down and in. Don't just basically tip it over like that, because then that'll put a lot of air bubbles into it. And the more air bubbles you get into it, the more clouded it can be, depending on the mixture that you've bought. But also, the more it will sink while it's curing. So, on that point, what you don't want to do is get a container with a lid, make your mixture, and then start shaking that up. It may mix it all up, but you've also put a rather large amount of bubbles into it, which then will sink down afterwards, and you'll have to do a lot more mixtures, and it can make, the epoxy look terrible. Trust us, we've tried. Another thing on that note is, do not use any paint mixers. Same issue, except with this, it seems to make it go incredibly cloudy. And again, with all the bubbles, it's just not worth doing it. Make a mistake there. Another thing we haven't tried personally yet, we haven't really had a need, is a vacuum chamber. A lot of people tend to use them to basically get all the air bubbles out of the mixtures, but the brands that we've picked seem to do a good job of evacuating the bubbles themselves, so we haven't had a need for that yet, but it might be something to consider if you're having trouble with air bubbles in it. So when it comes to sealing the wood to prevent any leaks then from the epoxy, I've got a large selection of tapes that we trialled during the experiments. I'll go through each of them now. So we first started off with this silicone tape. It's 50mm. It's meant to be good for epoxying as it doesn't stick to it. However, it also doesn't stick to any of the wood. It's got very poor stickiness to it, so we ended up getting lots of leaks from that. It was also quite expensive, so we ended up stopping that pretty quickly. Next up, we tried good old duct tape. So this one stuck to it pretty well, but what happened was the epoxy reacted with the glues on this, which caused a bubbling effect in the epoxy, so ended up ruining it. So that one was a no-go. Next up, we tried plastic parcel tape. So it's 50mm again, same as the other two. This one didn't stick to it very well, and I think it had a similar glue reaction, so it leaked and reacted, so that was a no-go. So thinking we could do something a bit wider, we swapped to the paper parcel tape. This stuff sticks incredibly well to everything except paper and cardboard, which is its intended use. Grumble, grumble. But when it came to the wood, it stuck on incredibly well, but due to the fact it's paper, the epoxy ended up soaking through and leaking out of it. So again, that's a 75mm, so wider made it better. But then after that one, we trialed this tape. This is DPM tape, so damp-proof membrane tape. It's waterproof, and the glue on it did stick well. However, it was an absolute nightmare to get off afterwards, which was actually a similar problem to the parcel tape. It's an absolute nightmare trying to get it off cleanly, and even trying to sand them off, it's gummed up the belts pretty nastily, so it was a nightmare and not really worth doing. So next up, we decided to go with some 100mm painter's masking tape. The extra size made it a lot more convenient. It sticks to things well, and it also sealed so that no liquids came out. This stuff also, after the job was done, peeled off really nicely. It left a slight ribbing effect, obviously from the actual tape, on the epoxy surface, but that polished up pretty nicely afterwards. So when it comes to taping, painter's masking tape is definitely the way to go, and the wider the tape you get, the easier it is to stick on. But obviously, if you're only doing a very thin crack, you obviously don't need it as wide. But again, we just get one tape and it does everything we need. So that's going to cover it for this video then. That has hopefully covered all the things that you need on just general use of the epoxy. In the next video, I'll do one about all the jigs and contraptions that we've made to make the job even more efficient and help to do as much epoxying in one go as you can. So I hope to catch you in the next video. Thanks for watching.